Welcome to another episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit Show. I'm your host, Mark Casera, and for over 60 years, my passion has been everything aviation. I love airplanes. On the Lessons from the Cockpit Show, we debrief some of the most fascinating and intriguing pilots, aircrew members, maintainers, and aviation enthusiasts from all over the world. What we do on this show is we hear these aviators' stories, but more importantly, what did they learn from these extreme and extraordinary military, commercial, and even private flying events? The purpose of the show is to educate listeners on how does the aviation world work, but more importantly, improve critical thinking skills both in the air and on the ground. Our second purpose is to allow some of these great military people to tell their stories, and some of those stories are being told here for the very first time. On today's show, I'm going to tell you about an event that motivated me to really become an Air Force pilot. And it was a worldwide event. Everybody was watching this. Financial support for the Lessons from the Cockpit Show comes solely from Wall Pilot, aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. At wallpilot.com, there are 127 ready to print very detailed profiles of aircraft that you can peel off the vinyl and stick to any wall or flat surface. We also do custom aviation art. If there's an airplane that you've always wanted on your wall with your name on it, your tail number, your weapons load, we can do that. Go by wallpilot.com and look at some of these ready-to-print profiles that you can choose from right now, or send me a custom form and I'll draw one up for you. So, grab an adult beverage of your choice, sit down, strap in, and let's begin the Lessons from the Cockpit Show and talk about this event that really did have an influence on me, but it had an influence on the rest of the world too, because it scared the stuffing out of all of us. I started my formal education when we were living in Fountain Valley, California. I went to Thomas Paine Elementary School, which unbelievably is still there. And not too long ago, my son, living in Southern California, was like right around the corner from it. And when I Googled his address, it brought back a whole bunch of memories during my time period as a kid living on Margarita Avenue, just 2 blocks down from Thomas Paine Elementary School. One of the other great things about my childhood and aviation was the Marine Corps and Navy helicopters were using an auxiliary field just on the other side of these really tall trees from our house. And when they were in the pattern, they would literally fly right over the top of Margarita Avenue. And I was just fascinated by these old helicopters over our house. There were 3 helicopters we saw a lot, all of them made by Sikorsky. The SH-3 Sea King was just coming into the fleet, and the Army and I believe the Marine Corps were flying H-34 Choctaw and H-37 Mojave helicopters. And they would be down really low over our street. As a matter of fact, a bunch of high school kids one day tried to hit one with a rubber ball and were throwing it at the helicopter trying to hit it. Well, of course, you know what the helicopter guys are doing. Let's dip down a little lower, see if the kids can hit us. And one day, one of these high school kids bounced a rubber ball off the side of a Choctaw helicopter. Well, that auxiliary airfield is now called, I think, Miles Square Park, there in Fountain Valley, just south of Thomas Paine Elementary School. And there was one time period where there was a lot of helicopters flying. They were practicing a lot. And I think I was either in kindergarten or first grade when this was going on. And I remember there was a lot of helicopters flying, and we were doing something weird at school. The bells would go off and our teachers would holler at us, "Hide, hide, hide." And kids were crying when we were doing this. Now, it wasn't very far to my house on Margarita from Thomas Paine Elementary, and I remember going home and my mom and dad were really, really nervous And in the evenings, they would watch the news and they were riveted to the news. And I remember my mom gathering all us kids up on the couch, and she was crying. She was emotional. And I couldn't understand why all these people around me were crying. Kids at school are crying. My mom's crying. My dad is looking really worried. And I just couldn't figure out what was going on. I'm just a 5-6-year-old kid. It wasn't too long after this we moved to Atlanta, Georgia, when my dad took up another job in the defense industry. And he spent a lot of time with Martin Marietta Corporation. And during the summertime, he would take us on these trips with him to Orlando, Florida. Do you know that you can go look on Google Earth right now and you can still see some of the remnants of its history, particularly in the southwest corner of the airfield? And I just went on Google Earth tonight and looked this up again, and you can go all the way back to 1985 on the timeline and look at Orlando International Airport. And I remember being at the Holiday Inn that had this great big huge indoor pool, and us kids would wait for my dad to get home and we'd go out to eat at these wonderful places that were there in Orlando. But one thing I really enjoyed watching was the B-52s and KC-135s flying out of McCoy Air Force Base, which later became Orlando International Airport. Go look at Google Earth. The Strategic Air Command Alert Pad is still there to this day. And years ago, when I was down in Orlando, I can't remember for what, it was when I was working with Rockwell Collins. I was there in Orlando, and I actually drove to the alert pad that's there, the alert Christmas tree there at Orlando International Airport, identifier MCO. You go to Orlando, you visit Disney World, it says on your boarding pass MCO. That's because of the history of Orlando International Airport as McCoy Air Force Base. And during this time period where my mom was bawling and kids were crying in school and my dad was really worried, McCoy Air Force Base became one of the most important airfields in the United States. All of Florida was about to sink under the weight of the armed forces that were brought in during this time period where my mom was emotional and kids are crying in school and we're ducking under our desks. And when I was doing my research for my book, I was Googling nuclear war and Cold War stuff, and I found a website that had a lot of interesting stuff on it. And I thought, well, wait a minute, what is this? And I clicked on it. And I immediately started reading, and for the next 3 hours, I did not stop reading. Because what I had found was a document that had been top secret but declassified that was called Strategic Air Command Operations during the Cuban Crisis of 1962. And folks, when I was reading this thing, it was chilling because now I understood why my mom was crying, why all the kids were crying as we're dashing under our desks during civil defense drills where the bell would go off and we'd all hide under our desks because of a nuclear strike from Russia was coming via missiles launched out of Cuba. In my next episode, I'm going to relate to you the bomber and tanker operations that were going on at the same time. Again, it's all found in this one document. I'm going to link to the document in the show notes so that you can get at this. We hear wars and rumors of wars and potential nuclear war with Russia right now. Those of us that are 60 years old and older have already been through this during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was intense. So in this episode, let's talk about the intelligence collection that went on during the Cuban Missile Crisis based on this Strategic Air Command document. Some of the information I'm going to talk about is also included in 2 books. One that's called, I believe it's a 1 Minute Before Midnight, that is about the entire Cuban Missile operation and what went on both politically and militarily. And the other one is a book all of you should have in your library. It's called Blue Moon over Cuba. Captain William Becker, he was the advisor to the movie with Kevin Costner about the Cuban Missile Crisis that came out a long time ago. Can't remember the name of the movie right off the top of my head. It'll come to me toward the end of this. But let's talk about the intelligence collection that went on around Cuba. And we'll discuss that 14th of October flight of the U-2 over Cuba that found all these missile sites. And it was only 7 minutes long. That's all it took, 7 minutes. The United States kept its eye on Cuba ever since the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. They knew that the communists were moving in there, Fidel Castro's taken over, and he gave the Kennedy administration a real bloody nose. And it's one of the reasons that President Kennedy did not trust the CIA. But the CIA becomes real important in this story because the CIA director at the time, John McCone, is still watching Cuba and he sees some increases in activity. And remember, when it comes to intelligence, patterns of life is everything. Trying to establish patterns of life and the things that are going on gives you huge clues that something's happening or something's going to happen. And he notices one thing: ship traffic. There's an increase of ship traffic to Cuba. And not too long after the increase in ship traffic, they notice that things are being offloaded and convoys are spreading out across Cuba. That's when they start overflight of the Cuban territory. They're trying to find out what's going on. And so airplanes are flying around Cuba, around the periphery, and this begins in March of 1962. So for 7 months prior to the actual Cuban Missile Crisis, there had been intelligence flights down to Cuba, both electronic, some of them photographic, a number of them weather reconnaissance. The electronic intelligence collection flights pinpoint two types of radars. These long-range electronic intelligence collection flights are being flown by the 55th Reconnaissance Wing. Famous wing, still in existence, flies out of Offutt, but was flying out of Forbes Field, Kansas. And they're using a version of the B-47 bomber called an RB-47. They come back with all of this electronic intelligence, and they're downloading the tapes, and they're seeing spoon rest, long-range radar. Well, spoon rest is the radar that is associated with the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile. And we've already had experience with SA-2s when Francis Gary Powers, flying his U-2 over Russia, is shot down when a bunch of these missiles are salvoed against him. One of them hits him, he's able to get out, but several hit Russian fighters that were trying to get to Gary Powers too. So we know about the SA-2 system, we know about its components, and they see these spoon rest radars, and then subsequent ELINT missions, they see the fan-song target tracking radar too. Now they realize, hey, SA-2 sites are going up around Cuba, and the CIA director, McCone, asks, what's going on? He's trying to establish these patterns of life. What are they trying to defend in Cuba? What is it that is being done in Cuba that requires these, at that time, extremely sophisticated SA-2 surface-to-air missile system? Strategic Air Command also flies other electronic intelligence missions in an airplane that was called a GC-130 flying out of MacDill Air Force Base, Tampa, Florida. These GC-130A ELINT missions were given the name Quick Fox missions, and they begin in June of 1962. And they're flying these missions around and giving very specific information to the NSA about all of the electronic intelligence that they're gathering. And some of that is actually redacted in the SAC report. But they're flying missions out of MacDill, and they're collecting on all of these SAM sites are going in. And I think they come up, there's 26 different SA-2 sites that ring Cuba, which McCone starts asking more questions. Why in the world have they just completely encircled Cuba with SA-2 missiles that can go up to 60,000 feet? We already know that SA-2s can hit the U-2 because of the Gary Powers incident of 1960. So there's a lot of concern about these surface-to-air missile sites being built around Cuba, and they look like nothing else in this world. An SA-2 site looks exactly like a Star of David. There's a missile at all 6 points, and in the center is a target tracking radar, the Fansong radar, and somewhere close by is the Spoon Rest radar, which is its long-range early warning radar, and they're all tied together. 26 of these sites. And McCone and all these intelligence folks are like, what is going on? What is it they're trying to defend? Well, what they're trying to defend is Khrushchev and Castro have already made plans to move medium-range and long-range ballistic missiles into Cuba, and they want to make sure that no Bay of Pigs type of things happen again, or there's some air campaign to go down there and take out all these missile sites. So they have put an air defense network up to keep them from doing this. Later on, Tactical Air Command takes over responsibility of all of the Quick Fox missions, and SAC is just focusing now on their ELINT missions and soon their photography missions. Strategic Air Command had continued to fly electronic intelligence missions around Cuba with their RB-47Hs. These were given the nickname Common Cause missions, and these missions began to ramp up from 1 mission a day, subsequently up to 3 missions a day, beginning on the 14th of September 1962. Now, these are what they call ferret missions. They're looking for all of these SAM sites. They're looking at all of the electrons that are being radiated out of Cuba, and the Navy believes the first one that radiates dies. They're getting a lot of information from these ferret missions that begin on the 14th of September to pinpoint where all of these SAM sites are. So from the 14th of September right up to the time the first U-2 flies over the top of Cuba, President Kennedy and the national security apparatus of the United States has a pretty good picture of what's going on in Cuba electronically from these Common Cause missions. Now, they're also flying weather missions, monitoring what's going on there. RB-47s, again, are flying these also. They're called Blue Ink missions. And these missions are flown, I think, every other day to just kind of watch and see what the weather is, because we're getting into the fall. Weather's going to start getting wet and rainy down there, and if we're going to do operations down there, we have to keep a close eye on the weather. So the Blue Ink missions are sending back real-time weather information around the island of Cuba. All of the Common Cause RB-47 missions are getting refueled by our brand spanking new tanker, the KC-135. KC-97s are still in the mix, and we'll talk about that later in the bomber and tanker portion. You still have reciprocating engine tankers as well as jet tankers that are required to do all of these refueling missions, but many of the missions, because they're so far away from the KC-97 bases, are being done by KC-135s. The very first Common Cause mission on the 14th of September has a tanker, an old A model that comes out of Altus to give it gas. It refuels one time and flies about a 7-hour mission and collects a lot of really good information. There are 4 Common Cause ferret missions flown from September to the 14th of October. Once the U-2 missions began over Cuba, they were flying 2 a day. On the 14th, 15th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th of October, there was 2 Common Cause ferret missions flown a day. Throughout the Cuban Missile Crisis, they went to 3 a day until about the middle of November. So we have a pretty good look at all the electrons that are coming out of Cuba from these Common Cause missions. Let me get back to the Blue Ink missions real quick. The weather reconnaissance missions were very important because we had to know what the cloud cover was over Cuba. If you're planning the U-2 missions where you're flying at 60,000 feet or higher, it doesn't do you any good to fly photo reconnaissance over a target area if it's covered in clouds, if there's overcast. So these Blue Ink missions became very important as the U-2 missions began ramping up. And again, these RB-47s of the 55th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing out of Forbes Field, Kansas, are doing all of these missions. All of these missions need air refueling. The RB-47s are air refuelable, so KC-97s and KC-135s are involved in every one of these missions. In total, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 116 Common Cause RB-47 ferret missions were flown during that period. While flying these reconnaissance missions, a big issue developed. Obviously, you do not want to file a flight plan to Cuba. What they would do is airplanes that would fly Cuban missions would file a flight plan to Miami. When they got to Miami, they would fly what's called due regard, where you kind of become your own air traffic control, which meant you turned certain things off inside the airplane. You don't want to be identified by the Cuban long-range radars or the target tracking radars, so you turn things off. The problem that created was U.S. fighters intercepting our R-47s that were coming back from these missions. And in one case, a pilot of an R-47 almost had the tail gun fire on a fighter that was intercepting it coming back to Florida. Fortunately, he didn't fire. In order to alleviate this interception problem and a potential blue-on-blue engagement issue, they began squawking at certain points. On their return, flying around Cuba, they weren't so concerned. It was always when you're returning to your base from Cuba, they're thinking, okay, what's coming? And things got a little dicey. But once they put out these new procedures for intercept, visual identification, squawks, that blue-on-blue situation disappeared. There is one electronic intelligence collection mission that made history. It happened on the 30th of October, so it's kind of right in the middle of the crisis. Special electronics intelligence gear was put on a YB-58 Hustler. The Air Force wanted to test, could the B-58, being as fast as it is, be a relatively good intelligence collection platform? Air Force Systems Command coughed up the airframe. They retrofitted it with all of the electronic intelligence equipment. General Dynamics coughed up the crew to fly the airplane, and Strategic Air Command planned the mission. On this single mission, the YB-58 flew across the northern edge of Cuba, gathering ELINT information, didn't find anything significant. They downloaded all of the recorders off of it. They didn't see anything out of the ordinary, and that was the only time the YB-58 intelligence collection Hustler flew during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now let's get into the U-2 flights. You have to understand the U-2 spy plane at this time period is owned and mostly operated by the CIA. The CIA had been flying photographic reconnaissance missions since the spring of 1962. During these photo reconnaissance flights, they were able to find missile patrol boats, surface-to-air missile sites, short-range, shore-based cruise missile sites, and even MiG-21 fish-bed fighters at some of their air bases. Oddly enough, none of them found medium or intercontinental ballistic missile sites during that time frame, even though some of the excavation was being done prior to the 14th of October. On the 3rd of October, CIA and government officials met with Strategic Air Command and told them, you need to take over these missions. Strategic Air Command planners immediately began working the next day, 4 October, on an operations plan that was called 67-63, which is Strategic Air Command U-2 overflights of the island of Cuba. All the U-2 overflight missions were given the code name Brass Knob missions. So whenever there was a U-2 overflight mission, it came under the category of Brass Knob missions. Now, Strategic Air Command was flying a version of the U-2 spy plane, but there was a new version called the U-2F, which had just recently been undergoing tests at Edwards Air Force Base. So the 4080th Reconnaissance Wing sent two of their most experienced pilots to Edwards Air Force Base to get checked out in the new U-2F with the upgraded engine. These two pilots were Major Richard Heiser and Major Rudolph Anderson. Rudolph Anderson is the U-2 pilot that is later shot down and killed over Cuba. The U-2F had the new J-75 engine in it, which allowed that version of the airplane to climb 5,000 1,000 feet higher and operate at 75,000 feet. There was also one other thing that was included in the new U-2F model, and that was it was air refuelable. The U-2F could pull up behind a KC-97 or a KC-135 and take on gas, although it never did. Major Richard Heiser arrives at Edwards Air Force Base first. So he gets training doing touch-and-go landings and performance of the new engined U-2F model at Edwards on the 12th and 13th of October. The emphasis of his flights is, of course, on takeoffs and landings. Takeoff and landing in the U-2 can be pretty challenging, as most of you know, with the pogo wheels on the wings and having a car chase you down the runway, calling out your altitude. It's a very tricky airplane to land, and that's why they were focused on the takeoffs and landings of the airplane. On the 12th of October, while Major Anderson is getting checked out in the airplane, General Powers, the commander of Strategic Air Command, is landing in Washington, D.C. after an overseas inspection tour. The Secretary of the Air Force wants to see him. They sit down and they immediately begin discussing the Cuba situation. The Secretary of the Air Force asks Major Powers, hey, can your U-2 pilots perform these missions? Of course, General Powers says, yes, we can. The Secretary of the Air Force tells him, we want you to begin these immediately on the 14th of October, which is Sunday. And that is when Major Heiser flies his very first flight over Cuba on Sunday, the 14th of October, 1962. An extremely historic day for air reconnaissance and air power. The 4080th Strategic Reconnaissance Wing is located at Laughlin Air Force Base, Texas. Their wing commander, Colonel DePortes, finds out via message from SAC headquarters that they're going to begin U-2 overflight operations of Cuba. He has 21 of his maintenance folks gather up all their stuff, and he flies them to Edwards Air Force Base to have them prepare 2 U-2F models for the overflight missions of Cuba, which are going to begin Sunday, October 14th. Major Heiser's U-2 spy plane is loaded with what's called the B camera and 2 ELINT systems called 1 and 3. What those ELINT systems are and what they entail, I've not been able to find out. But if you go look at these B system cameras that are in the reconnaissance bay of the U-2, it's massive. It's really big. It's a big piece of machinery, but it's got great picture capability for the 1960s. On the 13th of October at 11:30 at night, Major Richard Heiser takes off from Edwards Air Force Base in his U-2 and heads across the Southwest. California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, gets to the Gulf of Mexico, turns south to the Yucatan Peninsula, gets to the Yucatan Peninsula, turns east. 70 miles south of the Isle of Pines, Heiser makes a left turn as he approaches Cuba, heading slightly northwest. Passing west of the Isle of Pines, passing west of the Isle of Pines, Heiser turns on his cameras as he approaches the low swampy area of the Pinar del Rio province. Now, this camera configuration is made by the Hycon Corporation out of Pasadena, California. It has a 36-inch focal length and is specifically made for high-altitude reconnaissance missions like this. And I told you the camera is huge. It weighs 420 pounds and has 2 6,000-foot rolls of film inside. Heiser is operating at 72,500 feet when he's flying over Cuba, which means the camera is giving him about a 6.5 mile by 6.5 mile square picture on the ground. The camera has 7 picture-taking positions, 3 right oblique, 1 vertical, 3 left oblique, meaning it can go side, over the top, to the other side. He's only over Cuba for less than 7 minutes. He's in the quote-unquote danger zone for the SA-2s for 12 minutes. After he gets back into the Gulf of Mexico, he turns northeast and heads for McCoy Air Force Base, now Orlando International Airport, landing at McCoy at 11:30 Eastern Time. Those 21 maintenance folks during his 7-hour flight have gotten on an airplane, left Edwards Air Force Base, and now are at McCoy Air Force Base in Orlando to receive him. All of the exposed film is immediately downloaded and is flown to Washington, D.C. under the personal care of Strategic Air Command's Intelligence Director, Brigadier General Smith. And while in D.C., they begin the processing of all of the film. While all of that film is being processed, they are planning 2 missions for the 15th. Heiser taking off out of McCoy, Anderson taking off out of Edwards in the second U-2F model. But it's got a defective tail strut, and they have to bring in a new tail strut from the Lockheed Burbank facility where they're made. Well, Anderson's going to run out of crew rest if he takes off after the maintenance is done. So they figure out another way to get him to McCoy. What they do is they fix the airplane, and a weather reconnaissance pilot based at Edwards flies the U-2, ferries it to McCoy, and a KC-135 takes Anderson to McCoy so that he can get into crew rest and fly the second mission on the 15th. On the 15th of October, 2 U-2 missions overfly Cuba, Heiser flying the first one, Anderson flying the second one. Both of the missions on the 15th of October fly the length of the island of Cuba with the B-series cameras in the reconnaissance bay. Landing at McCoy Air Force Base, again, the film is downloaded and is immediately put on, I believe, an F-8 or RF-8 Crusader that is flying at like Mach speed to Washington, D.C. so that they can get the film processed. These 3 flights are the flights that prove medium-range ballistic missile sites at San Cristobal particularly, and one other one, the name escapes me, are being developed in Cuba. These are the 3 flights that start the Cuban Missile Crisis and potentially World War III. In a 2005 interview with Richard Heiser, he said, "I didn't want to be known as the guy that started World War III, so I'm glad this thing ended peacefully because I didn't want my name associated with my taking pictures of these missile sites in Cuba and World War III beginning." This is the evidence that President Kennedy uses to begin the quarantine of the island of Cuba on the 22nd of October. On Heiser's flight of the 14th, here's what they find. There are 3 sites at San Cristobal. One has 4 launchers all ready to go in it. 2 are almost complete. On the 15th of October, Heiser and Anderson find intermediate range ballistic missile sites at a place called Guyana-J. There's 4 launchers in some of them. They're still putting equipment in at others, but they are going as fast as they can to get these sites operational. Khrushchev wanted to get these sites operational before the Americans found out, and the Americans preempted him. The cat's out of the bag, and now we know there are intermediate range ballistic missiles in Cuba that have 2,000-mile range and can reach beyond the Mississippi River. Pictures of a cruise missile site at Santa Cruz del Norte show that there are already cruise missiles in place. And at San Julian Airfield, there are crates of IL-28 Beagles on the airfield. There are bombers on Cuba also. Now that they find all of these sites, the 17th of October becomes a very crucial day. Now remember, Common Cause ELINT missions are going on. Blue Ink weather reconnaissance missions are all going on at the same time, all supporting the U-2 overflight missions. On the 17th of October, there are a total of 6 U-2 flights over Cuba. Heiser and Anderson take off from McCoy and fly 1 flight each. 4 flights come from Laughlin in the old A models, but they still have the B configured cameras in their reconnaissance bay. Unfortunately, one of the cameras in the A models from Laughlin doesn't work, but they still collect an incredible amount of information as they fly lengthwise over the island. On the 17th, 2 more medium-range ballistic missile sites are found. They also find 39 MiG-21s and a handful of MiG-15s at Santa Clara Airfield. On the 18th, Heiser and Anderson take off out of McCoy. Heiser covers the western 2/3, Anderson the eastern 1/3, and they find more missile sites. The 19th, 4 flights find another intermediate range ballistic missile site at a place called Remedios. So between the 14th and the 19th, there are 6 medium-range ballistic missile sites, 3 intermediate-range ballistic missile sites, and 28 IL-28 Beagle bombers, all of these offensive weapons, all on the island of Cuba. By the 20th of October, all of the U-2s that were flying operational missions were located at McCoy, and this was kind of their typical day. They usually awoke around midnight, had breakfast, and then headed off to the operations center. In the operations center, there were weather folks, navigators, intelligence planners that put together their mission folders. They would then go through a very extensive briefing about their mission, the take points where they're going to turn the cameras on, what they were looking for. And after that briefing, they'd head to the flight surgeon's office. 2 hours prior to takeoff, they would have a complete physical check and then begin donning their suits because they're above 50,000 feet. They're all in pressure suits. About an hour prior to them taking off, they would begin breathing pure oxygen. They would go out, pre-flight the airplane, and took off about 8 o'clock in the morning from McCoy, and most of the missions lasted between 2 and 5 hours. Upon returning, they would get debriefed, begin downloading all the film, looking at the airplane, and debrief the pilot on the mission, what he saw, and of course the performance of the aircraft was part of this debrief. That was a typical day for a lot of these pilots. And you have to remember, some of these guys flew 5 or 6 times during this intense period, like Major Rudolph Anderson. From October 23rd through October 26th, the weather in Cuba deteriorated and they didn't fly any missions. And again, this is the rainy season down there till November. So they only had about 10% of the island that was not covered in clouds. The 27th, they began flying again, and this became a very historic day because the only casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis happened on the 27th, and it was Major Rudolph Anderson. Major Anderson, taking off on his 6th mission out of McCoy Air Force Base on the 27th, does not return. There is a search for him around the island. They don't find anything because the airplane has come down on the island. He tried to avoid the missiles, but one exploded close to the aircraft and fragmentation from the warhead punctured his pressure suit and he died. On the 4th of November, United Nations and Swiss delegates negotiated with the Cubans and they returned Major Rudolph Anderson's body to the United States. President Kennedy awarded Major Rudolph Anderson the Distinguished Service Medal because of his heroics over Cuba on the previous 6 missions he had flown. All U-2 overflights of Cuba were halted until they could figure out what happened to Major Anderson's airplane. They began once again 2 days before the end of October, but this time part of the procedures was to have an RB-47 about 50 miles offshore that was monitoring all of the electronic spectrum, particularly looking for any surface-to-air missile target tracking radars that might be engaging the U-2 spy planes. From then on, none of the U-2s were engaged. It was during this time period when all of the U-2 flights had been halted that Khrushchev made a deal with Kennedy that he would take all of the missiles and offensive weapons out of Cuba. So subsequently, the U-2 flights began monitoring the loading and moving out of all of the offensive weapons out of Cuba. U-2 missions continued through the month of November. Again, looking at Cuba, making sure all of these weapons were being moved off of the island. And then they finally came to a halt. There's one last mission I want to cover from Strategic Air Command's history of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They were called Blue Banner missions. The Navy was having a hard time marshaling all of their assets to find all of these ships. One in particular called the Grozny. So the Department of Defense asked Strategic Air Command, can you help us find and locate and photograph and monitor all of these ships? Well, of course, that fell on the RB-47s at Forbes Field with their KC-97 tankers. These RB-47s were moved down to Kindley on the island of the Bahamas, tough duty there, but they were also flying out of lodges and other bases in Florida on these Blue Banner missions. The KC-97s would refuel the RB-47s that flew about 6 to 7 hour missions, photographing, monitoring, and tailing all of these Russian ships that are now leaving with all of this equipment on board. And of course, the RB-47s are photographing everything because the intelligence analysts are looking at the photographs and they can tell what's inside the ship by what's on the deck. They had really good books that would say, okay, if you see this kind of crate, then it's probably got this kind of stuff in the hold of the ship. And they were correct. Now, the Grozny was a particular thorn in everybody's side because they lost track of it. And so a mission was put on just to go hunt the Grozny. Now, an RB-47 that was flying a Blue Banner mission about an hour and a half after it gets refueled from a KC-97 that's based in the Bahamas at Kindley, finds the Grozny and says, hey, we found it. Here it is. Here's its location, course, speed, all those kinds of things. They start taking pictures of it and they circle over the top of it for almost 2 hours until a U.S. Navy destroyer finally catches up to it and monitors the rest of the way. But Strategic Air Command kind of pulls through once again on these surface search, sea search missions called Blue Banner missions and monitoring all of the Russian ships that are leaving and cataloging what's on their decks. Before I go into low-level operations, I want to give you a couple of lessons learned that maybe they're lessons observed because we keep doing this to ourselves over and over and over again. And there's 3 specific things I want to talk about before I move on to the low-level photography operations, particularly where the Navy's involved with their RF-8 Crusaders. There are 2 categories of problems we constantly run into. One of them deals with classification. One of them deals with logistics. Let's start with classification first. We saw it Desert Storm. We saw it in Kosovo. We saw it with our coalition partners in Afghanistan. Again, when we went into Iraq, we keep banging our heads on the stupid classification problem. Well, you can't see that because you're not cleared for it. Well, our coalition partners can't see it because they're not cleared for it. We keep bumping our heads every time into this classification problem. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, this classification, secret, top secret code word, ugly dragon shows its head once again and breathes fire on everybody. Now, remember I told you the CIA was operating the U-2s before Strategic Air Command took over. Eisenhower realized that if military pilots were flying the U-2, it could be considered an act of war if one of them flew over an enemy's airspace, like Francis Gary Powers when he was making his overflights of Russia. Well, when you're dealing with the CIA, you're dealing with classification problems, secret, top secret code word kind of stuff. And sure enough, there's 2 things that bite the military services in the butt again, dealing with classification. The first one is the routes that the U-2s are flying are considered top secret because, once again, this is a new collection platform. And the second thing about the U-2 overflights is the classification of the photography and the photos that they're taking, because those photos are considered top secret code word. That code word was talent. So there's people that really need to see these photographs, but because they have these classification levels on them, they're not allowed to see them. And because the U-2s are flying up so high on certain routes, those routes are also classified and can't be shared with anybody. You see where I'm going with this? We ran into the very same thing during the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq with our coalition partners. And some of our partners, I'm talking the Brits, the Aussies, the French, I mean, really good coalition partners that we fought wars with for a long time. Let me give you one modern day example from the Kosovo War. F-117 stealth fighters were based at Aviano Air Base in northern Italy. They were flying missions, of course, only through the night, and there's kind of a high classification level on the things that they're doing, particularly their routes and the targets they're hitting. One of our coalition partners during the NATO air campaign over Kosovo wanted to find out what the stealth fighters were doing. We found out that their very sophisticated spy plane was only flying during the time periods at night the F-117s were flying. So F-117s were moved out of Aviano Air Base back to Spangdahlem Air Base, Germany. And to make them even stealthier from everybody, they were given F-16 kind of call signs, the same call signs that the F-16s were using. Now, there's a really funny thing that happened one night when we had a German brigadier general who was in charge of all of the execution of the air campaign. He sees this package of airplanes coming out of Germany, his home country. They're flying with F-16 call signs, but he knows they are not F-16s. And he turns around to the entire CAOC floor and says, okay, here comes the Americans being sneaky again. Because this German Air Force Brigadier General didn't have the security clearance to know what the F-117s were going to do, because after they all stealthed up, they would go across Yugoslavia and Belgrade, hitting their targets and coming back out. But he had the common sense enough to know that F-117s moved to Spangdahlem. These airplanes were originating out of Spangdahlem. They weren't F-16s. He knew that. And so he just blatantly and quite sarcastically announces to the entire CAOC floor, okay, here comes the Americans being sneaky again. We all laughed. All the Americans laughed. I mean, what could we say? We were caught doing something that we shouldn't have been doing. He should have been able to understand and know what was happening because he's the guy that's directing the air campaign. We ran into the same thing during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The U-2 operations were considered top secret code word because of their CIA origin and now because of their super sophisticated cameras that are taking these wonderful pictures. Let's turn to logistics. If you're going to war, make sure that you have all of the stuff that you need. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we didn't have all the stuff that we needed. The U-2 spy plane B camera configuration, like I told you, was using a very specific type of film canister, a 6,000-foot film canister, and they were running out. Well, you can't have U-2 operations with the B camera unless you've got those 6,000-foot rolls of film canisters that you can plug into them. We actually had a film issue. We're shooting all of this U-2 6,000-foot roll of film, and now we're about to start shooting more film doing the low-level missions. And we didn't have enough film. A matter of fact, at one point, they only had about 2 weeks of film left in stocks. They had to go out and do emergency requisitions. And of course, when you have something unique that the U-2 is using, it's not something that you can just go to Pasadena to Hycon and go, dude, we need more of these things, because they have to order all of the stuff, the film, the canisters, all that kind of stuff from their suppliers in order to be able to make these things. So sometimes there's a long logistics tail, particularly when you have very unique kinds of things you're using during the war. And film was one of them. Next logistical problem. If you're flying over enemy territory, you better have really good maps and charts of the terrain, the infrastructure, the power lines, all of those different kinds of things, because if you're flying low level and fast, those can become obstacles that will take your airplane out of the sky. And all of us that have been in the military military have seen the little blurb on charts of enemy territory that says, hey, we're not real sure what's in this area right here, so be careful when you're flying. You're about to start low-level operations. You need a tactical pilot's chart with really, really good detail because you're using clock to map to ground. You're looking at ground reference points. You're looking at specific locations now, San Cristobal, where they know that they have these medium-range ballistic missiles, and you need to be able to plan your mission using the right kind of charts with the right detail, the right scale, and the right projection. Guess what they didn't have? Well, all of these maps were locked up in a certain location, and you had to requisition these things, which means paperwork, time, when you don't have time. You are working in a very time-sensitive situation, and you cannot wait 3 hours, 3 days for you to get the right kind of charts with the right detail, the right scale, and the right projection if you're going to fly low-level missions. So I wanted to give you some background lessons learned for what's about to happen when these low-level missions begin. In the last section of this episode, we're going to talk about the low-level missions that really proved what was going on in Cuba at the time. At NAS Jacksonville in Florida, there was a RF-8 Crusader photo reconnaissance squadron called VFP-62 that became extremely famous during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But all of the pilots had already had experience flying down to Cuba because the skipper, Winslow, had called a lot of the members together and said, hey, we're going to be flying for the next couple weekends and we're going to be going south. So in April of 1962, VFP-62 with these photo reconnaissance crusaders began flying missions in and around Cuba. They were told to look for anything unusual or military. That's a very broad term, obviously, but they took a lot of pictures, didn't find any of the missile sites. They did begin seeing some of the SAM sites being put up. In July of 62 is when Khrushchev and Castro finally signed the arms deal, where now they're going to bring in all of this military hardware to include the nuclear missile capability. Because Castro figures, what has he got to lose? They've already tried to invade my country. We were able to fend them off. So he's kind of emboldened by the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. And Khrushchev is thinking, we're going to bring communism to the West whether they like it or not. And this is a good chance to do it. There's a funny anecdotal thing that happens during this time period because they bring MiG-21 fish beds, which are one of the newest interceptors, down to the island of Cuba. Well, obviously there's some language barriers there between the Russians and the Cubans. Our intelligence collectors are listening in to all the radio traffic around Cuba, and they hear this exchange. The Russian MiG-21 drivers are trying to come in and land. Now, in the Soviet model, the ground controlled interceptor GCI guys run the show for the fighters, and they're trying to speak in Spanish, and the Russians don't have a real good grasp of that. And finally, out of frustration, one of the Cuban controllers says, just speak Russian for crying out loud, and just tell us what you're going to do. And he gives him his position. He goes, look, follow my directions because you're over a crocodile nursery, and if you go down there, they're just going to gobble you up. Well, that transmission is intercepted by us. And that's kind of how they confirm some of these fish beds are being flown by Russian pilots. The Russian and Cuban pilots, of course, are trying to intercept the U-2s, which are flying way above their service ceiling. But there's a lot of distrust in the U-2 spy planes at the moment. People are real uneasy about using this asset. May of 1960, Francis Gary Powers gets shot down over Russia. They have a U-2 that goes way off course and actually flies over Sakhalin Island of Russia during a mission. And in September of 62, a Taiwanese U-2 spy plane that's overflying China is shot down and its pilot is taken prisoner. And several more U-2s are shot down during these overflies from Taiwan, looking at China and collecting information. So there's a lot of people in the State Department and in government that don't trust the U-2 spy plane and its operations. There's got to be a better way to get information. And obviously, tactical air photography and reconnaissance is the way to gather more photographic intelligence of what's going on. And on some of these VFP-62 RF-8 Crusader missions, they are taking pictures of these SAM sites that are going up. And they see these SAM sites becoming operational, and they realize by the 29th of August, hey, this whole country of Cuba is going to be surrounded and completely defended by SA-2 missile sites. The CIA director, John McCone, he's trying to connect all the dots on what are these SA-2 sites going to protect. On the 4th of September, the Foreign Service guy, Dobrynin of Russia, is meeting with the Kennedy. And they ask him, we want your assurance that there are no offensive weapons that are being placed on the island of Cuba. And Dobrynin lies. He goes, we assure you there are no offensive weapons that are being placed on the island of Cuba. The Kennedys and our administration already have photographic evidence that that is not the case. And they know Dobrynin is lying, which of course raises everyone's anxiety level even more. We see all these ships coming down. MiG-21s are flying. SA-2 SAM sites are going up. Something's going on down here. And now Dobrynin tells them, no, we ain't doing nothing down here. We're just down here, enjoying cigars in the sun. On the 8th of September, Castro receives from Khrushchev and from the Minister of Defense the new arms list of everything that will be coming down there. That list includes intermediate range and medium range ballistic missiles, IL-28 Beagle bombers, MiG-21 fighters, MiG-15 fighters, and coastal defense cruise missiles. All of that is delivered to him on a list on the 8th of September. On that same day, the Minister of Defense and their Chief of the General Staff signs a memorandum saying that the Cubans can use the nukes if they feel threatened. They are given free range to use those nukes against the Americans if the Americans choose to invade again. Really chilling stuff going on here. And by the 11th of October, our military already has a short reaction operations plan called O-Plan 312 that is the air campaign to go take out the SAM sites, the airfields, and whatever else they find down there. Because this is also the same day, the 11th of October, that the last of the SA-2 missile sites that are ringing Cuba becomes operational. So think about this. On the 14th of October is when we start flying U-2 missions. On the 11th of October, we've already determined that all the SA-2 sites are operational. So think about this. On the 11th of October, 22 of the 24 SAM sites that are down there are considered operational. So there's some real anxiety going on within the American military and government right now over what's happening down there. When you are putting together an operations plan like this, tactical air photography is critical because you have to build mission folders for all of the targets you're going to strike. And the only way that you can get the pictures of the targets to give to the pilots that are going to bomb or missile them or whatever we're going to use against them is by low-level or tactical photography. At the beginning of September, there is a command change in VFP-62. The commander of VFP-62, Commander Winslow, and is relieved by Commander Bill Ecker. He's the man who authors the book Blue Moon over Cuba, which I recommend to all of you. It is a fantastic book that he wrote and is extremely well researched and well written and gives great information to all the things that are going on. So Bill Ecker now takes over VFP-62 and this RF-8 Crusader unit that has about 20 airplanes in the squadron. So he's only been commander of VFP-62 for 5 weeks when he hears other things that are going on in Cuba, and he is given basically a warning order on the 13th of October to begin preparing his squadron for low-level photographic operations over the island of Cuba. He receives this warning order the day before Major Richard Heiser flies his famous mission on the 14th that finds the San Cristobal medium-range ballistic missile sites. And it's on the morning of the 16th of October, Kennedy is still up in his bedroom eating his breakfast when McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, comes up and says, "Sir, we've got photographic evidence that there is in fact medium-range ballistic missiles on the island of Cuba. Dobrynin lied to us. There is offensive weapons on the island of Cuba. Khrushchev has been trying to get these things in there before we found them. We have found them." President Kennedy is also just weeks away from the midterms. We have a major crisis happening where World War III may begin 5 weeks before the midterm elections. If he screws this up, the midterm elections are not going to go well for the Democrats who are in office. McGeorge Bundy shows him some of the photographs. There are launch sites for SS-4 Sandal missiles that can strike Washington, D.C. in 14 minutes. They have no chance of evacuating anybody if these missiles launch from San Cristobal area, specifically the site that's in the Sierra del Rosario Mountains, not too far southwest of Havana, Cuba. U-2 overfly missions find intermediate range missiles also there. They find the coastal cruise missiles. They see the crates with the Beagles in them. The Kennedy administration, right before these midterms, has a lot on their plates. They have to stop World War III from happening. And the afternoon of the 16th, while McNamara is talking to all of the chairmen, they make the decision to fly tactical photo reconnaissance missions, low-level reconnaissance missions over the island of Cuba. They have to find out what all this equipment is and get down lower so that they can photograph it and begin cataloging what it all is. The Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Anderson, tells McNamara the best group to do this is VFP-62, based at NAS Jacksonville, Florida. And he agrees. And there's a reason for that. And here's where we get back to logistics once again. After the Korean War, the Navy began investing heavily in tactical photo reconnaissance. They had these huge World War II, Korean War era cameras, and they knew we cannot continue using these cameras. They're too big, they're too cumbersome, the film isn't right, it's just a big headache. VFP-62 and their RF-8 Crusaders have the new KA-45 and 46 cameras made by a company in Chicago. These cameras had been created in the Navy by an Admiral Dietz, who basically took on this tactical photo reconnaissance mission and said, we have got to improve how we do this. We need new cameras. We need airplanes that can hold these things. We need better training for our pilots to do low-level navigation. All of these things, which the Air Force had not done. The photo reconnaissance airplane that the Tactical Air Command is using is the RF-101 Voodoo, and it doesn't have these cameras in them. They don't train in low-level photo reconnaissance. There's all these limitations to using the Air Force's RF-101. And in fact, when they start flying some of these low-level missions, the photography that the Air Force brings back, some of it's unusable, and the RF-8 Crusaders of VFP-62 have to refly the missions. So the Air Force is at a real disadvantage here. And of course, McNamara picks the right unit to do it. But VFP-62 needs to get closer to the action. And of course, the warning order is now being churned out for them to deploy to what's called Boca Chica in Key West. And it's now called Naval Air Station Key West, Florida, where they fly out of. And that means they only have to fly 90 miles to Cuba from Key West. The Navy Admiral that is the Atlantic commander for the Navy realizes that they're going to need more of these cameras. So they go to the Chicago manufacturer and say, hey, we need more of these. Well, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at this time is General Curtis LeMay, and he realizes the Navy is about to give us a bloody nose because of our lack of capability in tactical photo reconnaissance. And he goes up to Admiral Anderson and says, hey, I want some of your cameras so I can put them in my RF-101 Voodoos. Anderson is reluctant at first. Hey, sorry, we got this. We developed it. It's our camera. But somehow Curtis LeMay cajoles Anderson into splitting the order in half, and part of the cameras do make it into the RF 101 voodoo. But remember, training in low-level missions and all these different things, Air Force hasn't done any of that. Navy has. So VFP 62 does a fantastic job because they've been trained for it, they got the right airplane for it, and they got the right equipment for it. Commander Ecker receives his warning order on about the 16th or 17th to prepare for operations beginning 22nd, 23rd of October. This is where that classification and logistics issues start rearing their ugly heads. Since Strategic Air Command in the United States Air Force controls all the U-2 flights now, all of the Air Force pilots are given the U-2 spy plane photos. They all have them. They're all doing their mission planning, looking at all the targets. They don't give them to the Navy because of classification. Sorry, you can't see these. And now the problem you have is VFP 62 is going to fly these low-level missions, and they're not allowed to see the photographs because of the way they're marked with the secret code word and with all the annotations of all the equipment. We can give them to all of our Air Force bubbas, but the Navy, they're not allowed to see them, so they can't do their mission planning. And this is where this classification thing starts biting the Navy when they're getting ready to do the missions. Now, a Navy lieutenant commander has these photographs in a briefcase. And when he's down at VFP 62, one of the guys there says, "Look, I know you've got these things in your briefcase. I know you're carrying these things." And that Navy commander tells him, "Here's the piece of paper with the coordinates." And he's like going, whoa, wait a minute. I need the photographs. Nope, you can't have it. Well, I suggest you do whatever you need to do so that my guys can see those photographs, and I'll be back from getting my cup of coffee in 5 or 10 minutes. And sure enough, that gentleman takes those razor blades, cuts out all the top secret talent code words, cuts off all the annotations, and burns them right there in the room. And this Lieutenant Commander Cortege of VFP 62 comes back in. Now he's got the photographs. He begins doing all the flight planning, and he sees that the stuff doesn't match up. Wait a minute, we're in the wrong place. When he looks at all the target coordinates, we're in the wrong place. What's going on here? And he can't figure it out. So he runs them again, does it all again, submits the flight plans for approval, denied in Washington, D.C. So he comes back into the room and he goes, "Hey, let's look at this all again. Let's plot it all out again." And he goes, what grid references are you using here? He goes, "Well, we're using this." And he realizes the grid references are wrong because the map additions are wrong. Now he has to requisition the correct charts or maps that are the correct additions that have all the right grid references on them. So goes to one of his drivers, and his admin says, "Hey, go to Jacksonville and get these charts from our map shop." Driver gets there. He's told he cannot have them. It's now war-ready material, these charts, and he's not allowed to have them. So Cortege has to make more phone calls to Washington, D.C. to one of their liaisons that's up there. I can't remember the guy's name. And they make a bunch more phone calls. And finally, a lieutenant is called on the phone and said, "Give him the maps." And the driver gets them, makes a phone call. "Hey, I've got them. I'm on my way back." Now they're able to do all of their flight planning because they're told, here's the target areas, here's the grid coordinates, all of these things. We've got the right charts. They do all of the flight planning. And guess what? The flight plans come back approved. Imagine that. And now you understand why I gave you that quick foundation in classification and logistics just prior to talking about the low-level missions. All of the VFP 62 pilots and maintainers deploy to Boca Chica at Key West, Florida. And they're getting the jets ready to go. Maintainers sleeping on the ramp. They're getting all the film ready. All the pilots are being briefed on the routes of flight, but they still can't be told what they're looking for, even though they've got these unclassified U-2 photographs. In the briefings, all of the pilots are told, look for things that are unusual. You'll know when you see them. And they're like, wait, what? And they're just told, you'll know when you see them. They'll look something like this. And they're shown these, ridiculously high overhead pictures of these different places of where these missile sites are and where the airfields are. On the morning of the 23rd of October, which I believe was a Sunday, Joint Chiefs of Staff are all meeting in the Pentagon with McNamara. They're all discussing what's going on and what they need to do. It's 8 o'clock at the ready room of VFP 62 at their new deployed location of Boca Chica. The phone rings. There's a voice on the end of the line when Bill Ecker picks up the phone that says, "Get ready." Doesn't even identify who he is. He just says, "Hey, I'm calling from the Pentagon, get ready." And so all of the pilots get all their stuff on. They're all getting ready. This person in the Pentagon also tells him, "Don't hang up." So Ecker's getting everybody ready. They're getting their flight suits on. They're getting all their equipment on. They're flying in new tan flight suits instead of their normal orange flight suits. And they're all ready to go. At 10:57 Eastern Time, almost 3 hours later, the voice on the other end of the phone says, "Okay, Commander Ecker, are you ready?" He goes, "I've got 6 airplanes out there ready to go, 2 spares. All the pilots are suited up, ready to go." The voice on the end of the phone says, "Go out to your airplanes and start engines." And they all scramble out there and start engines. And this requires some time too, because they have to have these huffers that help start the engines of all the airplanes. All 8 aircraft are on the ramp, manned, ready to go, engines running, wasting gas. And finally, the voice on the end of the phone says, "Taxi to the end of the runway and take off." Now everything goes into hyperdrive. All of the airplanes taxi to the end of the runway, but they're doing it completely communications out. And we have worked out procedures, and we've been doing this forever, where you get a green light gun from the tower. All 8 of these F-8 Crusaders make it out to the end of the runway. They're flying in 2 ships, and their call signs are red, white, and blue. Red 1, red 2, blue 1, blue 2, white 1, white 2, and they've all got specific areas that they're going to. Ecker and his wingman, I believe his name is Willoughby, Lieutenant Willoughby, they're going to San Cristobal, the very first place that medium-range ballistic missiles were identified. Finally, they get the green light gun, and off they go, heading to the south and to the east. While they're flying down there, they're flying it very low. They're maybe 100 to 200 feet off the ground, and they fly through a rain squall. The weather is crappy, and he's worried now our missions may be failure. We may have to abort because of this stupid weather. It's raining cats and dogs. He says it's just pouring. But he says it's a good thing, too, because they're flying so low that they're getting salt spray all over the airplanes that is being washed off by the rainwater. So all of the rainwater is cleaning the airplanes up, which means it's cleaning the windows of the cameras up at the same time. And finally, about, I think, 20 miles north of Cuba, they break out, and he goes down even lower. He sees that Havana is kind of off to his 11 o'clock, so he's in the right position for his what's called initial point, which is the harbor at Mariel, which he can see because it's full of ships. He climbs up to about 1,100 feet and now turns his cameras on. The KA-45 and 46 cameras are 6-inch focal length cameras. They're made for going at 500, 600 knots between 1,000 and 1,500 feet and taking just beautiful pictures. And sure enough, he comes up to the area where they think something strange is going on, and there it is. The San Cristobal medium-range ballistic missile site is spread out underneath him. He's got his cameras on. One of his maintainers had written in front of the camera window, "Smile, you're on candid camera," after a famous TV show of the time period, and the film is rolling. And he takes these beautiful pictures of the liquid propellant sites. There's tents, there's missiles, there's erector launchers, there's assembly areas, but stunning is these semi-oval type of concrete bunkers that house the nuclear warheads. He gets it all. The other 2 flights of Crusaders get the same thing. Intermediate range ballistic missile sites run right over the top of them. One of the airplanes flies right over the top of a AAA anti-aircraft site, and they actually take pictures of the Cubans and the Russians running to the guns because they surprised them in a famous photo. And they head out of Cuba and then recover back at Jacksonville. They have to recover back at Jacksonville field because that's the place where they have this new photo processor for the cameras. But Ecker lands and he's told, don't get out of the cockpit, boss. And he's like, what? And one of his guys tells him, you are to be refueled and you are to go to Washington, D.C. immediately. And he goes, what's going on? He goes, I don't know, boss, but we were told to refuel your airplane, keep you in the cockpit. We have filed a flight plan. You can go supersonic all the way to Washington, D.C. to Andrews Air Force Base. Somebody's going to be there to pick you up, and they're going to, I guess, take you to the Pentagon. He goes, well, okay. That individual hands him a ham sandwich and a carton of milk. So while the airplane's refueling, Bill Ecker's getting refueled too. And off he goes up to Washington, D.C., makes it there in about 45 minutes, lands at Andrews, and a colonel from the Air Force named Stakely meets him at Andrews, puts him on a helicopter, flies him to the Pentagon, to the helipad, and escorts him into the Pentagon. Takes him down into the bowels of the Pentagon to probably what we call the tank now, where all of the Joint Chiefs are meeting. Admiral Anderson, the CNO's there. So is Curtis LeMay. And in the movie 13 Days, there's kind of a tense conversation between LeMay and Ecker where he asks him, were you shot at? Did anything happen to you? And he goes, no, it was a milk run. And it was, in fact, a milk run. They didn't get shot at or anything. But they want the film there at Washington, D.C. And they've got the ability to process it at the new National Photographic Interpretation Center, the NPIC, and they take his film and they start downloading it and start processing it right there, and they see all the stuff that Ecker sees. Now, while Ecker is there, he's being debriefed by all these admirals, generals, and colonels that are asking him, what did you see? What was going on? And of course, he tells his story over and over again. These photographs, of course, make it to McNamara, McGeorge Bundy. They show them to the president, and he's now got hard concrete proof. There are nuclear weapons and missiles in Cuba. On the 25th of October, Adlai Stevenson, our ambassador to the United Nations, goes in a Security Council meeting. Valerian Zorin, the Russian ambassador, is there, and they have this tense discussion. You know, you don't have any evidence, Zorin is saying, and we have all the evidence we need. And there's this tense discussion between the two of them that 13 Days, the movie, actually portrays very well. And finally, Adlai Stevenson says, you know, I'll wait till hell freezes over. Tell me yes or no, do you have offensive weapons there? And Zorin says, you know, you'll know soon enough. We'll tell you soon enough, and kind of blows him off. And that's when Adlai Stevenson uncovers the easel and starts showing him all of the photographs that the U-2s and the RF-8 missions have been taken. These missions were called Blue Moon missions, and of course were highly classified at the time. They continue flying these Blue Moon missions until Khrushchev says, okay, we will take all of these weapons out. Blue Moon missions continue during the dismantling and the retrograde of all of this equipment. And there's even a really famous photograph taken by an RF-101 Voodoo of one of the Russian ships being loaded up with missile canisters and so forth. And you can see the shadow of the Voodoo in the photograph. So these Blue Moon missions continue, and they have all this photographic evidence. VFP 62 is awarded the Presidential Unit Citation. President Kennedy flies down there himself to give that award to Ecker. And of course, several of the pilots receive Distinguished Flying Crosses for a lot of their exploits in these low-level missions over Cuba. These Blue Moon and Brass Knob missions are great examples of how military photo reconnaissance helps facilitate the political arm of our government. We can give them photographic evidence of events that are happening around the world. We can give them electronic evidence, photographic evidence. We can give them what we call measurement and signals intelligence. Tanks have certain frequencies when their engines are running and their tracks are moving. All of this is used by our politicians in Washington, D.C. and on the political stage to say, hey, look, we know what you're doing. We have evidence, and we can show you that you have lied to the world. There are offensive missiles in Cuba. Let me just add one more thing real quick. When I was teaching at the Joint Forces Staff College, I learned this format that's used in our government. It's called the DIME, the elements of national power. When we analyze a particular country, we use this format. DIME is an acronym that stands for Diplomatic, Informational, Military, and Economic. Every country that we deal with is given a strengths and weaknesses analysis based on the DIME, Diplomatic, Informational, Military, and Economic format. The Cuban Missile Crisis shows and proves that during this time frame, the United States was very strong in the information and military elements of national power, which made us stronger in the diplomatic side because we had all of this information. This time period, you could say, well, it's either a failure of intelligence or a success of intelligence. I would say both. We couldn't find those sites. It took us a lot of effort, but once we did find them, we were able to get the photographic evidence, we were able to get the electronic evidence that in fact those were there. And when President Kennedy's talking to Dobrynin and Adlai Stevenson is at the Security Council talking to Zorin, they were armed with the latest, greatest information that yes, in fact, there were offensive nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba. Now, I understand we've had diplomatic failures, military failures, and a lot of intelligence failures in our nation's history. I would say that looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis during this 13 days where this crisis was at a head, we were really, really strong informationally and militarily. Obviously, when we started the quarantine of Cuba, that was another strength. That took a maximum effort, though. There's hundreds of ships and airplanes that are flying these missions to police this quarantine or blockade, let's call it what it really is, of Cuba during this time frame. And the reason that we were able to be so strong was because we had really good intelligence information on what was going on. Except for the Grozny, which took us a little while to find, but we did. We still had a really good picture of what was going on during this crisis. President Kennedy had information via these photographs to make timely decisions and reduce risk. I've probably talked to you about the elements of the decision maker's dilemma, and there's 4 of them: risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. And in this particular instance, Kennedy was able to lower the risk of some of his decisions because he had quality information coming to him in a timely manner that affected the outcomes and the decisions he was making. So I just wanted to add that just real quickly. Again, the DIME, diplomatic, informational, military, and economic. That's the framework we use in the government to do an analysis of countries. Are they strong or weak in those 4 areas? And then the elements of the decision maker's dilemma: risk, time, quality of knowledge, and outcomes. If you have quality knowledge in a timely fashion, you reduce risk because you act with more certainty, and your outcomes are more certain because of the information that you have. On next week's program, I'm going to cover Strategic Air Command's operations during the Cuban Crisis of 1962 when I talk about the nuclear response to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And this is really going to be chilling when you hear all of this. The amount of tankers, the B-52 missions, what they were carrying, how many tankers and airplanes were on alert at that time period. It was very scary, and I understand why my mom was kind of emotional about all this. But again, I think this is a story that needs to be told, particularly during this time period where everybody's talking about wars and rumors of wars, and I just want to get this out. This episode of the Lessons from the Cockpit show is financially sponsored by Wall Pilot, custom aviation art for the walls of your home, office, or hangar. My motto is preserving history one aircraft at a time, and in the show notes below, I'm going to have a U-2 and probably a couple of other airplanes that were involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Please, folks, go by wallpilot.com and order 1 or 2 of these ready to print 4, 6, 8 foot long vinyl prints that you can peel off and stick to any wall. And remember, we also do custom orders with your name, weapons load, unit, patches, and even tail number on the airplane. Once again, I appreciate all of you tuning in to the Lessons from the Cockpit show. This and previous episodes of the Lessons from the Cockpit show can be found on my website under the podcast pull-down box. My book is also there. I also do public speaking. If you'd like me to come talk about aviate, navigate, communicate, and my 9/11 story, that's where you can contact me to have me come and speak to your group. Thanks for being with us today. Hope you enjoyed this, and we look forward to talking to you next week when we talk about the nuclear response to the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962.